Hello guys, welcome back once again in the another video of React Native. So in this video we will learn about use callback hook. So in my previous video we have discussed that how we use the useMemo hook. Use callback and useMemo are both hooks provided by React. So we can use the both hooks in the React and React Native. So use callback and useMemo are both hooks provided by React library. So we can use this in the React as well as in the React Native that serve similar purpose but are used in slightly different context. So we have many confusions that where we should use callback and where we should use memo. So in this lecture we will differentiate and implement that when we should use memo and when we should use callback. So in this lecture we will discuss the detailed discussion about the use callback. So useMemo actually return a memoized value computed by a function, and useCallback actually return a memoized callback function. So this is the basic difference between useMemo and useCallback. So actually useCallback also useful for preventing functions from being recreated on rendering. So this is the major problem, and preventing this problem we use the useCallback because on the every render the function is recreated. So this is the main area where we should use the use callback when you optimize the performance by memoizing a function, especially when you pass it to the child component or is it dependency in the use effect, or use memo use when you want to memoize the result of a expensive computation of a function, ensuring that it's only recomputed when necessary. This is useful for optimizing components that perform heavy computation or data transformation. So don't worry, this is just a theory. We implement all these things with the practical demo. So let's start with practical. So this is the code we are using here. So here we are using the two components. One is the parent component and second is the child component. So inside the child I am just added here a single log and just a return statement and nothing else. And in the parent I am importing this component in the parent component, and we are using here as a child component. And another thing, I am using here a button, and press on this button I am incrementing the value of the count1. Count1 actually the state variable is the count1 and count2, and when I'm clicking on the increment count1, then the count1 value is incremented and we are displaying here. And in the same way, when I'm clicking on the increment count2, so the value of the count2 I am using here as a function. I am displaying here count2 incremented value and I am displaying here. So UI of this is looking like this. So when I am just reload the application, so every time when I am reloading the application, so component is created. So child component is called here and this component is called. So this component is called every time when I am reloading the application and it is recreated. And again another thing, when I click on the count1, so it will increment the value of the count1. So count1 value is incremented here every time. And another thing, when I'm clicking on the increment count1, so every time the child component is calling. When the component is re-rendered, so every time child component is calling and recreating again and again, and it's decreasing the performance of the application. So in the same way, when I am clicking on the increment 2, so you can see this function is called. When I am clicking here, this function is called, and here I am incrementing the value of count2. So every time child component is called when the function is called, and this is not a good thing, because this activity decrease the performance of the application, because we don't need that every time our child component should be recreated. So for preventing of this, we can use here memo and we can wrap this child component inside memo. So you can see here, suppose I just again reload the application, and again I click on the increment count 1, so the child component is not calling here. And when I'm clicking here the increment count 2, so the child component is not calling on the click of the increment count 2 also. Child component is calling only a single time. So this is good, because with the help of the memo we can prevent the re-rendering of the component. We have also learned in our previous lecture that how we can use the memo in our component and how we can prevent the re-rendering of the component. So like this we can stop the re-rendering of this. Suppose now I comment this button here and I want to pass here the props increment count, and inside this increment count I am just passing this function as a prop, and inside this child component I will use this prop. So this is the increment count. I can use like this here, and here I need to button. So now I use this button. I am using in the parent component. So now we will add this button inside this child component, and here I will just pass here the name of the props. Okay, so now I save this and just check that everything is working correctly or not. So I just reload the application again, and I just click on the increment count 1. So you can see here we have fixed the problem of the re-rendering of the child component, but when I have added here the props as a function, so this problem is created again. So when I'm clicking on the count 2, so the child component is calling again. I'm clicking on the increment count 2, so now this button is inside the child component. So but why the child component is calling here again and again and recreating? So this is a problem. This problem is created because in the increment callback we are using here the count 2. So every time when I am rendering, so React Native compare the functions reference. So when we pass here the function as a argument, so this problem is created. How we can resolve this problem? So we can resolve this problem with the help of the callback function. So now the role of the callback function is required here. So this is the another hook of the React. So use callback, we just import here, and just I am creating this function as a callback function, and in the callback function we pass the two arguments. One is the callback function and another is the dependency. So here we will just add the dependency, and this is the argument, first argument, and this is the second argument. So I am just using here a blank array. So now we'll check what will be happened. So now just I save this and again check. So we need to add here a comma and just save this, and again I click on the increment count 1. So you can see here the increment count is working and the child component is not calling. But when I am clicking on the count 2, so child component is also not calling. So here we are facing another problem, because when I am clicking here, so you can see here the child component is not calling, but when I'm clicking here the count 1 value is not incremented here. Actually this is the value of the count 2 I am showing here, and this is the count 1. So this value is not incremented when I'm clicking on the count 2, because I am using here a blank array. So this function is calling only a single time. When I am reloading the application, suppose I reload the application again, so only then this function will be called. And again when I'm clicking here, So the memoized callback function is already stored inside the props. So in the child component we are using this memoized function increment count. So this function is only hold the last value. When the first time application is reloading, then whole function is storing inside the increment callback, and we are passing this function inside here. So the whole copy of the function is stored inside the increment callback, and we are using it here as a prop. So when the application is reloading, then this function is called only a single time, and again this function is not calling. So this value is not incremented. So if I am using here count2 and save this, so this value will be increased. But the another problem I am facing here, when I am clicking here, so the child component and increment callback function is calling every time when we are changing anything in the count2. So every time this function will be called. So if we are using here count2 and we are calling this function every time when we are clicking on the count2, so why we need use callback? Because the callback concept is that callback is storing the whole function in the cache memoized callback. So if we are using here count2 and we are calling this function every time when we click on the count2, so what is the benefit of the use callback? Because the concept of the use callback is that use callback storing the whole function and use this function as a memoized callback function. So we just call this function a single time, so we don't need to add here the dependency of the count2. Just click on this, so the value will not be increased. So the last value of the count2 is 8, so it will be stop on the 8. So another thing we will also resolve with this callback function is the useEffect. So here I am using the useEffect, and we also add here a dependency. So just I save this, and when I'm clicking on the count2, so the value is incremented. So when I'm using here count2 inside this callback and inside this useEffect, so the major problem we face here that every time when we click on the count1 and count2, so the useEffect and child both is calling. So now this is scenario we have that when we are clicking on the count2, so every time increment callback function is calling, and every time child component is calling, and useEffect is also calling with this. If I am passing here dependency as a count2, but we want that this useEffect will be called only a single time when we call the callback function. And another thing, this functionality should be work properly. Suppose I am removing this count2 from here and again check that how it is working now. So the count1 is working properly, no child component is calling and no other useEffect and another function is calling here. But when I'm clicking on the increment count2, so this is our callback function. So but when I'm clicking on the increment count2 button, so our callback function is calling, and with this count2 is not incrementing, so it destroying our functionality. How we can resolve this issue? So we can resolve this issue if we add here previous state. So we can add here previous state, and state is now a count2. So with the previous we will add a count2, and here we will just add the value 1 inside the previous count2. Yeah, so now I save this and just check again how it is working. So now just reload the application again, and again I click on the count click. So count1 is incremented every time and no child and useEffect is calling here. So just when I reload the application, then the child is called only a single time and useEffect is called only a single time. And when I'm clicking on the increment count2, so you can see here increment is also working and the memoize callback function is working now. because now the state is updating with the previous value of the state. So like this we can use the callback function in our application for improving the performance of our application. So I hope this video is very helpful for understanding that how we use the callback function in our application. So if you have any doubt, any query, so please let me know in the comment section. So if you like this video, please like, share and subscribe the channel. Thanks for watching.